I remember the sound of glass shattering before anything else, sharp and clean, cutting through the soft jazz and scattered laughter like a blade. For a brief second, heads turned, curious eyes flickering toward the noise, and then just as quickly, everyone went back to their wine and quiet conversations. But I didn't. I couldn't, because I knew exactly what I had just seen, and I knew exactly why my hands wouldn't stop trembling. Behind the bar, half hidden in shadow, my father was kissing my mother's best friend. Not something accidental, not a polite peck or a clumsy mistake. It was intentional, familiar, the kind of kiss that doesn't happen for the first time, the kind that belongs to two people who crossed a line long ago and never bothered to step back. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. My mind stalled, refusing to process it. I must have stood there for a full 10 seconds, completely frozen, the broken stem of a wine glass still clutched in my hand, my pulse pounding so loudly it drowned out the music. This was their 30th wedding anniversary. We had spent weeks planning it. Mom had wanted everything perfect. White string lights draped across the backyard, a photo slideshow glowing softly on the patio screen, tables dressed in navy linens and silver candles. Simple elegance, she had called it. That was her way. Quiet, graceful. Dad had insisted on inviting everyone, friends from church, people from the community board, and of course, Susan, Mom's best friend since college. I had grown up calling her Aunt Susan. She was always there, helping with dinners, picking out decorations, helping in ways I clearly hadn't understood before. The jazz band drifted into a slow tune, The Way You Look Tonight, Dad's favorite. He was supposed to be dancing with Mom, but Mom was across the yard, smiling politely as she chatted with neighbors, that effortless warmth people admired so much. She had no idea, or maybe she did. I stepped back slowly, trying to convince myself I had misread it. Maybe it was nothing, maybe just a cheek kiss that looked wrong from a distance. But then Susan laughed softly, her fingers brushing Dad's tie, leaning in close as she whispered something that made him grin like a boy half his age. That was when the truth settled in. I set the glass down before it could fall apart completely and turned toward Mom. She was already looking at me, not at them, at me. Our eyes locked across the crowd. For a second, I thought she could see everything written across my face, the shock, the anger, the quiet heartbreak. But instead of confusion, instead of pain, she smiled. Not just any smile, a calm, knowing one, the kind that said she was already aware. I moved toward her, my throat tight, ready to lean in and whisper what I had just seen. But before I could say a word, she lifted her champagne glass slightly, so naturally no one else noticed, and murmured just loud enough for me to hear, "Shh, the best part's coming." Then she turned, walked straight to the stage, and picked up the microphone. The chatter softened, the band lowered their volume. One by one, people turned to face her. My heartbeat picked up again, but this time it wasn't shock. It was something else, anticipation, maybe even fear. She stood beneath the string lights, bathed in the warm glow of candles. Her navy dress shimmered softly in the evening breeze. She looked stunning, composed, completely in control. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Thank you for being here to celebrate 30 years of partnership." The way she lingered on that word made a few guests exchange glances, but she didn't hesitate. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the bar, toward Dad and Susan, who had just separated, their faces pale. 30 years, she continued. 3 decades of love, laughter, and lessons. Some lessons take a lifetime to learn. A chill crept up my spine. Dad adjusted his tie, trying to look normal, but his expression had stiffened. Mom kept going, her tone never rising, never shaking. "When I was 24, I believed marriage was about trust. At 34, I thought it was about forgiveness. And now, at 54... She paused, took a small sip of her drink. "I've learned it's about courage." The crowd murmured uncertainly. A few polite claps broke out, unsure of where this was going. Mom let out a soft, gentle laugh. Not bitter, not cruel, just calm. "I'd like to raise a toast," she said, "to honesty, to friendship, and to the people who remind us that loyalty is not measured in years, but in integrity." I glanced at Susan. Her hand shook around her glass. Dad stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, color rising in his face. Mom lifted her glass higher. "To the truth," she said softly. "May it never stay hidden for too long." And then she drank. The guests followed hesitantly, confusion spreading in low whispers. When the applause faded, she handed the microphone back as if nothing unusual had happened and returned to her seat beside me. I leaned closer. "Mom, how long have you known?" She looked at me, her gaze gentle but sharp. "Long enough," she said quietly. Then, after a pause, "You can't rush a confession, sweetheart. You have to let people reveal themselves. It's far more satisfying that way." I sat there, trying to understand her calm. The woman who hosted dinners, led book clubs, volunteered at church. She wasn't naive, not even close. There was steel beneath that softness. Later, Dad tried to pull her aside, mumbling something about misunderstandings and too much champagne. She only smiled, patted his hand lightly, and said, "Relax, dear. The best part's still coming." That sentence echoed in my mind all night. By morning, the calls had already started. Every woman who attended the party was talking. My phone buzzed nonstop with questions I didn't know how to answer. But honestly, I didn't understand it myself. Mom's speech hadn't been loud or dramatic. No shouting, no scene. Just quiet precision that left everyone unsettled. Dad avoided everything. Susan disappeared early. Mom, on the other hand, stayed until the last guest left, thanked everyone, packed leftovers, smiled like nothing had shifted. But I could see it. Something had changed. She looked lighter. That night on the porch, under the soft glow of the lights, I finally saw it clearly. Not anger, not heartbreak. Power. Quiet, patient power. "You knew, didn't you?" I asked. She smiled slightly. A woman always knows the difference between silence and secrets. Later, when she sat beside me, she asked softly, "You saw them, didn't you?" I nodded. "I thought so," she said. "That's his favorite hiding place. He thinks it makes him invisible." There was no bitterness, just tired understanding. "You know," she added, "when a man cheats, he doesn't just betray his wife, he betrays the version of himself she once believed in." The next morning there was no explosion, no shouting, just coffee brewing, pancakes cooking, and tension sitting heavy in the air. Dad accused her of embarrassing him. She barely reacted. "I thought you handled that yourself," she replied calmly. When he stormed out, she simply exhaled and stirred her coffee. "He's not a bad man," she said, "just a man who thought no one was watching." She wasn't chasing revenge, she was waiting. And when she found out about the next meeting, she only said one word: perfect. From that moment, everything became deliberate, controlled, planned. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was preparing. By the time Monday arrived, the house felt different. Still. Heavy. Like something inevitable was approaching. Mom moved calmly through it all, steady and precise. Dad pretended everything was normal. But nothing was normal. That evening, she told me to prepare my phone recorder. "I'm done being quiet," she said. The next morning, she stood at the sink, watching the light filter in. "I spent 30 years loving a man who thought loyalty was optional," she said softly. "Now he gets to see what devotion looks like when it's gone." She slipped off her wedding ring and set it on the counter. The soft sound it made echoed louder than anything else. Later that day, we went somewhere unexpected. Not the store, not the bank. Susan's husband's office. When we walked in, it was clear he was already expecting her. She placed the photos on his desk, the truth frozen in reflection, clear, undeniable. He didn't react with shock, just a slow exhale. "So it's real," he said. "It is," she replied. Then she handed him something else, a recording. He took it without a word. "What do you want?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "But when everything comes out, I want you to know it wasn't my storm. I just stopped holding the umbrella." That night, Dad came home pretending nothing had happened until she asked one simple question. "How's Susan?" Everything cracked after that. And the next morning, it all came to a head. The knock on the door, Susan's husband standing there, a briefcase in his hand. Dad froze. Mom didn't. "Perfect timing," she said calmly. Papers were placed on the table, agreements, evidence, truth laid out neatly. Dad looked completely lost, like someone realizing too late the game had already ended. Mark slid a folder toward him. "This is a copy of the recording," he said evenly. "You might want to destroy it, though it won't matter. The original is already secured." Dad's face drained of color. Mom lifted her coffee, her voice soft, almost kind. "All I want, Richard, is transparency. You can have your accounts, your car, even your reputation if you're careful. I just want my share and my peace." He didn't move. He just stared at her like she was someone he'd never met. "You planned this?" he whispered. She tilted her head slightly. "No, you planned it. I just finally stopped cleaning up your mess." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mark packed his briefcase and nodded at Mom. "You're all set. Call me if he gets dramatic." "Always a pleasure," she replied smoothly. After the door closed, Dad sank into a chair. "You humiliated me," he said hoarsely. "No, Richard," Mom said quietly. "You did that yourself. I just gave you a microphone." He looked up sharply, his eyes wet with anger. "You think this makes you strong?" Mom stood, collected the signed papers, and said, "No, it makes me free." She walked out of the kitchen without looking back. That night, I found her on the porch, sitting with a glass of white wine, the documents stacked neatly beside her. The evening air smelled of rain. "Was that the plan all along?" I asked softly. She looked at me, her face calm. "No, the plan was to survive with grace. The rest came naturally." We sat together listening to crickets in the yard. The porch light flickered against the dark, and for the first time I noticed how still she looked. Not hollowed out, not bitter, just steady. After a while, she said quietly, "Do you remember when you were little and I told you never to chase someone who walks away?" I nodded. "Well," she said, eyes fixed on the rain beginning to fall, "I should have listened to my own advice sooner." The next morning, she didn't make coffee for Dad. She didn't leave his lunch in the fridge. She simply handed him a stack of envelopes, bank notices, lawyer letters, and one handwritten note. He opened it silently. It said, "You may keep the house, but not my silence." He looked up, searching for emotion in her face, but there was nothing left to find. Mom turned to me, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "Sometimes, sweetheart, peace comes disguised as loss. Don't be afraid to open the door when it knocks." Then she picked up her keys and walked out. Not in anger, not in haste, just with the quiet dignity of a woman who knew she'd already won. And I sat there, watching the door swing closed, realizing that the woman I called Mom wasn't broken at all. She was reborn. It had been a week since Mom walked out of the house, and every day felt like the air was learning how to breathe again. The rooms were quieter, yes, but not empty. They were lighter. Dad tried to fill the silence with noise. The TV too loud, the phone ringing constantly, his shoes echoing through the hallways as if pretending to sound busy could erase the echo of her calm. But guilt has a way of making a man smaller. I visited Mom every day at her new place, a modest rental on the edge of town with a porch full of blooming hydrangeas and sunlight spilling through the curtains. It wasn't big or fancy, but it felt alive. She looked younger already, freer. She started painting again, small watercolors of bluebirds, of morning light, of anything that looked like peace. "You know," she said one afternoon as I brought her groceries, "when you stop waiting for someone to change, your whole world gets quiet." I smiled weakly. "You always make it sound easy." She shook her head. "It wasn't, but sometimes quiet is the loudest kind of victory." Meanwhile, Dad was unraveling. The firm he worked for had started asking questions about inappropriate relationships with clients. The whispers were out. The very people who once toasted him at the anniversary party now avoided his calls. He blamed Mom for all of it. Of course he did. He came to see her on a rainy Friday afternoon, uninvited. I was there helping her unpack dishes. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, soaked in his expensive suit, she didn't even flinch. "Richard," she said calmly, "you're dripping on my welcome mat." He didn't smile. "We need to talk." She stepped aside but didn't offer him a seat. "You ruined me," he said, his voice cracking with anger. "You and that smug lawyer. You think I don't know what you did?" She crossed her arms, completely unfazed. "I think you did that yourself, but if it helps, you can keep pretending I had help." He glared. "Do you know how much I've lost?" "Yes," she said softly. "Roughly as much as I did 10 years ago when I found your first love letter from her." He froze. "You knew?" "Of course," she said. "Women always know. We just wait for proof kind enough to show itself." He looked at me then, perhaps hoping I'd defend him. I didn't. I just stood there, silent, realizing for the first time that I didn't pity him anymore. Then Mom's phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, read a message, and said, "Ah, that must be it." He frowned. "What?" "The dinner," she said simply. She put on her gray coat, grabbed her purse, and motioned for me to follow. "Where are you going?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "You'll see soon enough." The dinner was a charity banquet downtown, one she and Dad had both helped organize months earlier, before everything fell apart. It was a big event. Local politicians, board members, sponsors, all dressed in black and silver. The same people who'd been at the anniversary party were here, too. When we arrived, Mom looked radiant, poised, calm, and perfectly unbothered. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself like a woman who had nothing left to prove. Dad was already there, standing near the stage, talking nervously with Susan. Yes, Susan was back. Her face looked tighter, like she hadn't slept in days. When Mom walked in, every head turned. She smiled politely, greeted people by name, and accepted compliments as if nothing at all had happened. I followed her closely, my chest tight. I could tell something was about to unfold. The host welcomed everyone, thanked the donors, and then, as part of the evening program, announced, "Before we continue, Mrs. Elizabeth Clark has asked to say a few words." The crowd applauded warmly. Dad's face went pale. Susan stiffened. Mom walked up to the microphone, her heels steady on the marble floor. She took a breath, smiled at the audience, and began, "Good evening. I wasn't sure I'd be here tonight. It's been quite a year. But I believe when you've given 30 years to something, you should at least show up for the finale." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. "Nervous, unsure," she continued. "Marriage, as it turns out, is a lot like this event. You show up, you give what you can, and sometimes you realize the people beside you were only here for the buffet." The laughter died. You could have heard a pin drop. "But the beautiful thing about truth," she said softly, "is that it never hides forever. It just waits for the right moment to step into the light." She nodded to someone near the sound booth, and suddenly the room filled with a familiar voice, my father's. "I can't wait till she's asleep. Meet me behind the bar again." Gasps, the sound of cutlery falling. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Dad's face drained of color. Susan's eyes filled with tears. Mom didn't even blink. She let the message finish, then smiled gently. "I didn't plan to humiliate anyone," she said. "I just wanted to remind us all truth may take its time, but it always RSVPs." Then she set the microphone down and walked off the stage to thunderous silence. I followed her through the ballroom, past the staring faces, past my father's stunned expression. When we reached the exit, she whispered to me, "That, sweetheart, was the best part." And I finally understood what she meant all along. For a while, no one said a word about what happened at that dinner, but in a small town, silence travels faster than sound. Within 48 hours, everyone knew. The clip from that night made its way into a few cell phones, a few group chats, and eventually the local grapevine that never sleeps. It wasn't scandal in the Hollywood sense, it was the kind that spread through grocery aisles and church potlucks. People didn't shout, they whispered, and they all said the same thing. "Did you hear what she did? She did it with class." Mom became a kind of quiet legend, the woman who exposed the truth without losing her grace. Dad, on the other hand, shrank into the shadows he'd built for himself. The law firm suspended him pending internal review. His friends stopped calling. The golf buddies who once toasted him now turned away. He moved out of the big house and into a condo on the edge of town. I visited once. It smelled of dust and whiskey. He still wore his wedding ring. "Your mother humiliated me," he muttered. I shook my head. "No, Dad, you did that when you forgot who was watching." He looked up, eyes bloodshot. "Do you hate me?" I didn't know what to say. "I don't hate you," I finally whispered. "I just don't recognize you." Mom never said a cruel word about him in public. When people asked, she simply said, "We're both learning different kinds of peace." That was her way, never petty, never vengeful, just finished. She kept busy. She volunteered at the community center, started teaching watercolor classes for retired teachers, and donated part of her settlement to a local women's scholarship fund. When I dropped by one evening, she was sitting on the porch surrounded by her paintings, soft blues, gentle pinks, scenes of calm water and light. "Mom," I said, "how do you stay so calm after everything?" She smiled, eyes tracing the horizon. "Because anger ages you, sweetheart, but peace keeps you young." I laughed softly. "You sound like a preacher." She shrugged. "Maybe I'm just someone who finally stopped living for applause." Later that week, I helped her box up old photos from the house. We found one of her and Dad on their wedding day, two kids barely older than I am now, smiling like the world would always be kind. She stared at it for a long time, then placed it carefully in a folder labeled "What Was." "He wasn't all bad," she said quietly, "just human. I forgave him a long time ago, he just didn't know it yet." That Sunday, Dad showed up unannounced. I answered the door. He looked thinner, older, his pride worn down to something fragile. "Is she home?" he asked. Mom appeared behind me, holding a towel. She'd been painting again. "Hello, Richard," she said gently. He cleared his throat. "I wanted to apologize. I don't expect forgiveness. She interrupted softly. "Forgiveness isn't for you. It's for me. But thank you for saying it." He blinked, unsure how to respond. She gestured toward the porch. "Would you like some tea?" And just like that, they sat together, two people who had burned down a house but were learning to stand among the ashes without pointing fingers. They talked for nearly an hour about the garden, about me, about how the town still gossiped but would soon move on. When he left, he turned to her and said, "You always deserved better than me." She smiled faintly. "Maybe, but you were my lesson, and lessons are priceless." After he left, she exhaled deeply, the kind of sigh that sounds like closure. I sat beside her, and she reached for my hand. "You know," she said, "for years I thought being a good wife meant holding everything together, but sometimes being strong means letting things fall apart gracefully." That night, I saw her take off her wedding ring and slip it into a small velvet box. She placed it beside a new canvas, one she'd been working on all week. It was a painting of a shoreline after a storm, broken branches, scattered shells, and one small patch of sunlight breaking through gray clouds. The next day, she mailed the ring to a local jeweler with a note, "Melt it, make something new." Weeks passed. Dad quietly sold his share of the company. Susan and her husband moved to Florida, far away from the echoes of their choices. Life began to settle, but the quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was honest. One evening, as we sipped tea on her porch, I asked, "Do you miss him?" Mom smiled softly. "Sometimes, but missing someone isn't the same as wanting them back. I miss who we were before we forgot what respect sounded like." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She leaned back, watching the sky shift from orange to deep blue. "You know what the funny part is?" she said. "If he just told me the truth years ago, I might have forgiven him then, but by hiding it, he gave me time to become someone who didn't need him anymore." That line hit me like a sermon. When I left that night, she handed me the newly forged pendant made from her old ring, a small gold feather. "For you," she said, "to remind you that sometimes letting go isn't weakness, it's flight." And that was the last time we talked about Dad. Not because we forgot, but because we didn't need to remember in pain anymore. The truth had finally done its job. 6 months later, spring came early. The trees bloomed before the forecast said they would, and the light seemed softer somehow, the kind of light that feels like forgiveness. Mom had moved into a small cottage by the lake, about 20 minutes from town. It wasn't fancy, 2 bedrooms, white curtains, a front porch that creaked when the wind picked up, but it was hers. Every inch of it smelled like fresh paint, lavender candles, and second chances. When I pulled up one Sunday morning, she was already in the garden, wearing an old sun hat and humming to herself as she planted herbs. She looked peaceful, not in a fragile way, but in that deep, grounded way that only comes after surviving a storm. "Morning, sweetheart," she called. "Grab the basket. The tomatoes are finally turning red." I smiled, stepping out of the car. "You're glowing." She wiped her hands on her apron and laughed. "Freedom's good for the skin." We sat on the porch with lemonade, watching the water shimmer in the distance. I'd brought mail from the old house, mostly bills and magazines, but among them was an envelope addressed in Dad's handwriting. Mom sighed immediately. Her smile didn't fade, but her voice lowered a little. "Ah, I wondered when that would come." "Do you want me to open it?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, darling, I'll open it when I'm ready to read it." But after a long pause, she did open it. The letter inside was short, just 2 pages written in his careful script. He apologized for the lies, the pride, the way he'd let her carry their marriage alone while he chased his own validation. He said he'd moved to a quiet town in Maine near the coast and spent his mornings fishing, thinking about how easily a man can lose what matters most. Mom read every word slowly. When she finished, she folded the paper, set it on the table, and stared out toward the lake for a long time. Finally, she said softly, "It's strange. I waited years to hear him say sorry, but now that he has, it doesn't change a thing. I forgave him before he even knew he needed it." She reached for her lemonade, smiling faintly. "That's the gift of surviving betrayal, sweetheart. You realize peace isn't something he gives back, it's something you take back." We sat in silence for a while. The wind carried the smell of honeysuckle and wet earth. Somewhere across the lake, a child was laughing. I asked quietly, "Do you think he still loves you?" Her answer came like a sigh. "Maybe, but love without respect isn't love, it's nostalgia." I didn't know what to say, so I just took her hand. She squeezed gently. "Don't let what happened to us make you afraid to love, okay? Just promise me one thing. When you meet someone, make sure they see you, not what they want to see. And if they ever stop seeing you, walk away before you start disappearing." I nodded, my throat tight. She smiled, then leaned back in her chair.
I used to think the best part of my life ended when he betrayed me, but now I see that was just the intermission. That line hit me so deeply I had to look away. Later that evening, we took a walk along the lake. The sky was painted gold and violet, and the water glimmered like glass. She stopped to skip a pebble across the surface. It bounced 3 times before sinking. "Not bad for 54, she said with a grin. I laughed. "You're unstoppable." She smiled again, quieter this time. "No, sweetheart, I'm just finally at peace with stopping." When we got back to the cottage, she hung her old wedding photo on the wall, not in bitterness, but as a reminder of everything she'd learned. Under it, she placed the small gold feather pendant, the one forged from her wedding ring. I looked at it and said, "It's beautiful." She nodded. "It's lighter now." That night, before I left, she hugged me tightly, the kind of hug that feels like a promise. "Tell your story someday," she whispered, "not for revenge, for understanding. People need to know that endings don't have to destroy you. Sometimes they build you." I promised I would. Driving home, I couldn't stop replaying that moment, the anniversary, the microphone, the calm in her eyes as she whispered, "Shh, the best part's coming." Back then, I thought she meant the reveal, the truth, the scandal. Now I know she meant this, the peace, the healing, the quiet dignity that comes when you finally stop fighting for someone else's reflection and start honoring your own. If you're listening to this and you've ever been betrayed, lied to, or made to feel small, remember you can lose everything except your honor. And when you hold on to that, the rest will rebuild itself in time, because the best part is always still coming. So take a breath, hold your head high, and if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember what grace looks like when it finally wins.